So what happens if you actually try? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually grind out when the time's right? What if you actually blinded by your hindsight? What if you actually find out what defines life? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? I'm getting 1% better every day. I'm getting 1% better every way. I'm waking up every day to a sunny day. No matter what the weather say, life is like a record, so just let it play.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Best Day Ever Media. Sorry, I was trying to check to see if we were live on YouTube and Rumble. I think I see us on YouTube, so that's good. And it looks like Rumble might even be working for us as well. So that's fantastic. Adam, looks like you're in a different location. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm excellent. We're actually just fully packed up here in the truck, making my way down to the Citadel. I got Mayday. She's not stoked to be here, but she's here.
All right, excellent. Well, I'm not sure if we actually are on Rumble. It looks like Rumble's doing some weird shit, guys, but hopefully you guys can see this on Rumble, and if not, we'll always upload the video after the fact if for whatever reason Rumble does fail us. We've got a full news show to explore today, so I'm excited to jump into it. Obviously, we've got some of the usual suspects for story updates, but one of the big stories that I want to dive deep with you guys on is the idea of a pandemic amnesty. And so this came from The Atlantic. So that's one of the areas that I think we'll sink a decent amount of our time chatting about, because I really am curious your thoughts, your opinions when it comes to amnesty around the pandemic. Obviously, there was a lot of virtual, a lot of rhetoric, a lot of demonization of different sides. And it's something we've briefly talked about in the past on this show. And I don't have an answer. Usually I feel like I've got strong opinions and I try and have answers for a lot of these things. I don't when it comes to this. So I really look forward to exploring it with you, Adam, as well as the audience. So if you guys are watching this live, if you can see us, jump in that comment section just to let us know that this shit's working, because right now it looks a little suspect on my end. But anyways, we're going to keep riding here and jump into a few story updates first. So let's start off with the usual one, the recap of what's going on with the Emergencies Act. So recap day 13, this is from True North Media. Recap day 13 or Emergencies Act hearing. They kind of messed that up. Should be of text reveal feds plan to push extreme convoy narrative. Now, for anyone that was paying attention, I don't think this comes as a surprise, but I guess one thing I'm constantly shocked by, whether it's when we saw the Hillary Clinton emails leaked, when we've seen other email leaks, is, and in this case as well, discussions amongst our government and politicians, is how brazen people are about technological communications. Like, I guess I live in a world where I assume the NSA is capable of reading every single thing I send. And so I know that there's an Instagram lawyer, Robert Freund, I think. I'm probably mispronouncing his last name. He's a great follow. And one of the things he regularly states on his content is write every email and every text message as if a judge is going to be reading it. Now, I really do believe that that's wise advice, because far too often people seem to, like, I'm glad in this case that there's a paper trail here that we can bring up in the Emergencies Act, but I am kind of shocked at the brazenness of them being willing to communicate this way. You know, I would at least think that they would use telephone, which would be another layer of investigation, right? Versus when it comes to text messages, like, you can control F that shit pretty fast and get to the bottom of trying to like hone in on anyone that's maybe a bad actor. Awesome. I see a few people jumping in the YouTube comments, so we're definitely rolling there. Appreciate you guys. Let's get into this first story, though. On day 13 of the Public Order Emergencies Commission, text messages between Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's offices revealed a plan to get in on the growing narrative that the Freedom Convoy truckers were extreme. This is a direct quote here. I think there could be an opportunity to get in on the growing narrative of the truckers, wrote Mary Liz Power of Justin Trudeau's office to Mendocino's office. My thoughts of the framing here would be similar to what the PM Blair said last year when January 6th occurred. Alexander Cohen of Marco Mendocino's office said he was supportive but wanted to wait. There's a danger that if we come down too hard, they might push out the crazies. Now, let's read a little bit into that, right? It literally sounds like they were hoping something bad would happen and they didn't want to spook the crazies that may be involved with the Freedom Trucker Convoy protesters. That in and of itself shows such a disingenuousness when constantly Justin Trudeau's going out on the pulpit and talking about, how we need to come together, right? We need to do the right thing. We need to have no hate, no violence, yada, yada, yada. They literally were scared of spooking anyone that might do bad things if they spoke too harshly at the start of this protest. That to me is just so brazen in their communications here. And obviously, you guys know which side of the line I lean towards when it comes to the Freedom Trucker Convoy protesters. But this to me was like just a new level. Like in my heart of hearts, I already knew that this is what they hoped for, right? We regularly saw a framing of them talking about violence, about it. We saw testimony from, I think it was Lee Wright, saying that it was essentially like the movie The Purge. During this, we saw the arson hoax. There's been so many examples of the media misdirecting, sometimes outright lying, or using suspect sources in order to try and frame a certain narrative. And far too often, we saw the Liberals, and to a lesser extent, the NDP, happy to jump on that, regardless of what the facts said. In fact, again, those of you that maybe are inclined to want to give Mendocino the pass here and say that, like, maybe this is just his office or whatever, remember on April 27th, when giving testimony in a hearing, he referred to the arson again. That had already been disproven way back in March 13th when the Ottawa police and the Ottawa Fire said that the individuals that committed the arson, who have been arrested, had no affiliation whatsoever with the Freedom Trucker Convoy protesters. And yet he went forward and still tried to frame that narrative. This is beyond disingenuous, right? This is even beyond the silliness of the one member of parliament that said honk honk is the equivalent of Hail Hitler. But again, never forget the way they constantly tried to frame these people as extremists. And if it turned out there were extremists amongst the Freedom Trucker Convoy protesters, Mendocino's office, Alexander Cohen, admits they don't want, or there's a danger that if we come down too hard, they might push out the crazies. Adam, anything you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I remember the accusations, right, of being so conspiratorial and that the government's not this big cabal trying to lie to you guys. It's like we're literally doing all of this for your health and for your own good. And these people, when they're saying that these guys are racist, misogynist, fringe minority, like I can't imagine that the people that were saying that when they read these texts will feel justified in their statements at that time. And I mean, it's very obvious that this was a conspiracy at this point, like not as conspiracy theory, like the earth is flat, but like, no, like they actually conspired to make this play out a certain way. And that's how it worked out. So I'm, yeah, I mean, I can't say I'm surprised, but I do agree with you. It is brazen to put this type of shit in text, knowing full well that there would be an investigation after they use the emergency powers. So, I mean, at least we can feel some security in knowing that they're idiots. Like that gives me a little bit of security that they'll at least be caught for saying things like this. But at the same time, I highly doubt that we'll see any consequences come out of this.
And so one quick question here, Adam, because I agree, like to a certain extent, it's reassuring to see at least some degree of incompetence in their management of the situation. I'm not certain, though. I really have major concerns that this Emergency Act inquiry isn't going to come to the conclusions that I think myself or you maybe assume they must, right? We literally saw them trying to redefine the term violence. We've seen them constantly push the narrative of like loaded shotguns in Ottawa, despite the Ottawa police chief saying that there's been no charges. And hey, as of right now, November 1st, there's still no charges like 8 months later. So I really do have concerns that we're either going to see something like that's like, well, both sides were kind of wrong, so we'll call it a day. I honestly think that that's how it's going to, like, if somehow Justin Trudeau and his Liberal caucus come out vindicated because of these Emergency Act inquiries, I will lose what little faith I had left in our existing systems, our checks and balances, will completely be washed away, in my opinion. If we see some sort of middle of the road, like maybe it was justified, maybe it wasn't, we'll never really know. That for me would be par for the course. If we see real consequences, I saw someone jumped in the comments and said, we'll see a general election next year. If there are consequences like that, that would give me a little bit of hope, actually, in our existing system.
Yeah, but Matt, like this was my first question, right? When we started reviewing this, kind of day one was like, what teeth does this commission actually have? What are the actual takeaways or possible outcomes if they are found to be negligent in their use of that emergency order? And I think from my perspective, like, kind of your answer to that was just like, oh, it'll probably get escalated to the next higher order. And like, I do feel that like just the bureaucracy alone will just delay all these results for so long and nothing will come out of it. And I think that is a little bit depressing, but I do think that for anybody that is actually paying attention, like reading statements like this, reading text messages like this, listening to the Ottawa police chief, like anybody that regards himself as an informed citizen and paying attention to this stuff will see this. And I hope that will be just the little bit of light that they needed to confirm what they perhaps were being, people were calling me a conspiracy theorist for 2 years, right? And like, I think that people, that wears on them, right? Like that type of stuff piles on eventually. And at some point you may start believing that like maybe you were actually quite incorrect.
Do you mean to say that being gaslit for 2 years by every politician, every media outlet, and your neighbors and family and friends could actually cause severe trauma to an individual? That sounds wild.
Like literally your entire social fabric, right, was deployed against you from the majority. So I don't know if I could say majority, but a lot of people, right, were sharing that sentiment. So I wouldn't be shocked if there is still the informed individual there clinging on to something, and that this is perhaps that little bit of hope that they needed, even if nothing ever comes out of it, right? So I don't know. There's still some hope.
Another narrative that we frequently saw, and Jagmeet Singh was one of the biggest beaters of this drum, was that the Freedom Trucker Convoy was not going to be satisfied by anything other than the overthrow of the government and putting in a council instead of elected officials. So this came up during testimony as well with former Chief Slowly. Direct quote, was there any credible intelligence or evidence of activities directed ultimately to lead to the destruction or overthrow by violence the constitutionally established system of government in Canada? Asked Kitteridge. No, sir, Slowly replied. And again, this is the sort of thing where I think so many people are going to forget all the different bombastic claims made by our politicians. And this testimony, I understand that everyone that's testifying here that works for the government or an apparatus of the government is truly focused on covering their own ass first, saving their pensions before anything else. And so it's so frustrating to constantly see them try and frame things as like, well, maybe it doesn't meet the definition legally of violence, but it was the violence felt. No, like words have to at least some extent have meaning here, or else this is a completely meaningless fabrication. And it's so frustrating, in my opinion, to constantly see this trickle out. And part of the problem is, again, as we've talked previously, I don't think there's going to be a smoking gun. I don't think there's a silver bullet where all of a sudden everyone's eyes are going to be open. Because when I look at mainstream media's coverage of these testimonies in the hearing, they often are just focusing on the things that already fit their preconceived notions, right? The things that fit within the narrative they want. So, like, rather than talk about how there was no violence, they'll take the clip that it was felt violence. And again, your average person doesn't have the time to spend like 20, 30, 40 hours a week studying this shit the way that I do. And I get it. Like, I don't even want to throw shade at those individuals because you shouldn't have to, right? You should be able to take your government, at least to a certain extent, particularly when they're giving testimony, at face value. And yet you can't, as these hearings have consistently shown us time and time again.
Yeah, I agree with you, Matt. Like, I actually don't believe the average person either has the time, the interest, or the obligation to have to follow everything their government's doing with like a microscope. That's kind of the point of having elected officials, right? Is that you believe that you have some trust that they're acting in good faith, right? And it's just so crazy to watch that be eroded here. But this statement alone, like literally, was there any credible intelligence or evidence? Which literally any intelligence or evidence. So like literally anything. We've given you full carte blanche here. Was there anything to suggest that there was going to be an overthrow by violence? No, sir. That to me alone is enough for this emergency hearing. Like, okay, so how then do we justify literally something that we've never done in the history of this country if this guy can just say, no, sir, there was literally no evidence or credible intelligence? Like, that to me is amazing, dude.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Let's jump over to another quick little story here. I didn't think this one deserved a full section story for us, so just wanted to slide it in here as an update. This is from the Toronto Star. Ontario school workers say they'll walk out Friday after province imposes new contract. So this is in relation to support staff, and most school boards across the province say they will walk out of the job Friday, defying legislation introduced by the education minister to avert a strike while imposing a 4-year contract on them. This is nuanced, right? Whenever we get into labor negotiations and unions, I don't know if I like the direction the Doug Ford government is taking on this. I would love to hear your thoughts and your opinions, guys, though. If you're following this closely, jump in the comment section, give us your hot take. We'll keep you up to date as this develops, and we'll see come Friday if we end up seeing them strike or whether we end up seeing them essentially legislated or forced back to work. But yeah, just wanted to include that because I didn't want to miss that. But next, this is from the National Post. Trudeau's plan to freeze handguns spurred 6 months of incredible sales. Canadian gun retailers say that with handguns now illegal, 30% of their business has been taken away from them. However, this individual, at least that was interviewed here in this story, says that for the 6 months leading up to it, his handgun sales more than doubled. So again, it's just like, I more just want to put this as a placeholder here that it's funny constantly the unintended consequences of government and their policies. I think I saw something about this week there was a shooting in BC and a shooting in Toronto. Obviously, those criminals didn't read the rules, or else they obviously would have never done it, I assume.
Yeah, anecdotally, I was offered as much as 4 times retail for some of the firearms that I own, because they sold out. Like the highest quality ones sold out first, actually, and then sort of the final product that's been left on the market for the last, I would say, 3 to 6 months has only been like cheap Chinese models of pistols, and so yeah, I mean, anecdotally, at least all the friends that I have that are in the shooting world have all echoed that like absolutely everything was sold out, ammunition was sold out, firearms were sold out, took months to get transfers, and now people just before they actually announced this were going absolutely wild on the secondhand markets. So yeah, I mean, gonna be interesting to see how all that plays out over time.
Certainly, that doesn't surprise me, but I appreciate kind of your anecdotal experience there. And I forgot to mention, guys, you can find links to all of these stories in our Telegram chat. As always, I did forget to post it in advance of the show, so I'll post it right after we're done this show. That's my bad. The next story update here from Zero Hedge. This is about the Brazil elections. We previously covered it briefly, right? That they were going to end up into a runoff election. I I don't have a hot take here on whether these elections were fair and reasonable, whether they're not. These days, I'm prone to want to question the mainstream narrative, but at the same time, I haven't seen anything that's evidence that, there was hard shenanigans going on with this election. Bolsonaro supporters block roads as Brazilian president silent after election loss. Incumbent Jair Bolsonaro has still not acknowledged his loss with any public statements over a day after Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, I should practice these names in advance, was declared winner of Brazil's 2022 election held Sunday. So essentially, if I understand correctly, January 1st is when power will be handed over. I believe that the way this works in Brazil is that at the end of the day, it's going to be their Supreme Court. Or one of their courts that will actually choose to verify this election. So I don't think we've seen that yet, though that's likely to come today, if I'm not mistaken. We did see Putin and China's Xi come out and both, applaud Lula for their victory here in regards to this election. So we'll see how this plays out, but I think that this isn't the end of this story. And again, just wanted to kind of put that on anyone's radar that maybe overlooked it. Next, let's jump over to Timcast. this is going to get us into our first WTF story today. This one to me is just, like always, WTF stories are silly, but this one feels particularly silly. Elon Musk receives mandatory management training email from Twitter. There seem to be 10 people managing for every one person coding. And there is something just, it kind of feels like a little bit of hubris here, right? That you're going to send immediately an email to your new owner saying he has to go to Twitter 101 training and manager training, and he's got 30 days to complete it. And then after that, he needs to go to Twitter management training 201. Again, this all could just be like standard operating procedures and someone put this out, but you know, for those in Twitter that hope the boat's not going to get rocked, I think things like this are not going to be the path towards not rocking the boat, right? If nothing else, this is just going to be fuel for Elon Musk to troll you on. And I kind of hope he does it and then highlights some of the craziness that I suspect is likely in there. Anything quick on this, Adam?
Yeah, that would actually be epic. That's an angle I hadn't really thought of, Matt. But if he actually did go through the training and then highlight some of the craziness that was in there, I actually was just listening to Lex Friedman's podcast. It's number 333, and he had, and my God, I should have practiced this too. Andre, it's probably Andre Karpathy. And he's a former Tesla research and AI engineer. And he essentially was a high up manager and director at Tesla for AI. But anyways, really fascinating interview where he kind of dives into the mind a little bit of some of the practices that Elon exercises throughout his businesses. And like, I can just tell right now, if they're sitting there at Twitter thinking that everything's going to be okay and they can just like have all this bureaucratic process and stuff like that, they are in for massive change, to say the least, because that was honestly highlighted so many times in that interview on Lex Friedman's podcast that it wasn't even funny. And also touted as one of the best things for working with Elon, which I know there's fair criticisms, right? That he sometimes overpromises and underdelivers or doesn't meet timelines. But one of his engineer here, or former engineer actually, was claiming that like that was honestly one of the best things about working with him is that he can just get shit done. And I thought that was a great and fair point. And I'm excited to see what actually comes out of this with Twitter.
Yeah, and obviously, like, neither of us have ever worked for Elon Musk, so everything that we've heard about him is going to be like hearsay or secondhand. I get the impression, based upon the content I've consumed, that he's a very serious, like, severe manager. He's got extremely high expectations, but because of that, that's what drives a lot of the results that he's been able to accomplish so far throughout his life and his businesses. So it'll be interesting to see how this all evolves. The one thing that I think will be interesting to see how much information we actually get from Twitter, right? Because there will no longer be any obligations for them to be publicly reporting. They no longer will have to have public investor relationships. So again, a lot of this could be happening behind the scenes without our awareness. Essentially, the only information we get at this point in time is information Twitter chooses to disclose, information Elon Musk chooses to disclose, or information that leakers post. So again, this will be an evolving narrative, and I look forward to seeing how it plays out. Now, we're going to jump over for our second WTF story to the CBC, and thankfully, this is where our tax dollars are going. The hard-hitting journalism around bias in crosswords, how women, people of color, and LGBTQIA plus communities are overlooked. So puzzle solvers and constructors showed me why the push to update the world's favorite puzzles is so important. Now, at first, you might be like, Matt, the CBC puts out a lot of junk journalism, so why are you particularly picking on this article? And that's probably fair. But I guess I would have thought that crosswords weren't a monopoly. In fact, I kind of feel like crosswords are pretty simple to compile overall, right? Like, you literally just like, you put it together. You could use any words you want. So while I have no issues with people of color or the LGBTQ plus IA whatever communities wanting crossword puzzles to be more inclusive, I also just, I don't know if this is a hill to die on. But thankfully, you don't have to read this article if you don't have the time, because the CBC put together a 45-minute documentary on this as well to make sure that we get it deep into the world, as they call, of cross world. See the word pun there they did?
You're kidding me. There's a documentary on this.
Yeah. So this is where our tax dollars are going, right? Meanwhile, we've got like inquiries, right, around the Emergencies Act and constant information coming out about how Justin Trudeau, in my opinion at least, was absolutely not justified in his enacting of the Emergencies Act. But CBC going deep on crossword puzzles and their lack of inclusivity. I imagine next is word jumbles.
Fantastic. Hey, when will Sudokus get got? Because honestly, numbers,
Well,
racist.
I think we all know the implied racism of like the game Hangman, right? Remember that game?
Shit.
First of all, when's it going to be
Whoa.
hang people? And secondly, yeah, this is literally the world we live in.
Matt, thank you for your WTF stories. They get me.
Yeah, again, we need some of this to be able to laugh, because otherwise I'd be thinking about how $1 billion of taxpayer money goes towards this sort of charade. But anyways, let's jump into a real story here. This is the first story of the day. And technically all the stories we covered were real, but I just can't believe that they're real. This is from The Atlantic. It was making the rounds on social media yesterday. It's something that we've talked about before, and I actually really look forward to exploring this in a nuanced manner. I don't imagine Adam and I will solve the world's problems here in regards to the pandemic and how to respond to individuals that arguably promoted some of the hysteria that drove us into the crazy policies and government regulations that we experienced over the last 2 years. But I do really believe that this is a conversation worth having. And I understand those that maybe want to like shoot from the hip and just make bombastic claims back or demand absolute responsibility for all that are involved. But I'm not sure if that's realistic. And two, I honestly don't know if that's the path towards a better future or society. So that's what I want to explore with you guys today, and Adam specifically in this segment. But first, let's cover it briefly here. The Atlantic. Let's declare a pandemic amnesty. We need to forgive one another for what we did and said when we were in the dark about COVID. Now, first things first there, I already kind of take offense to the way this is framing, right? That both sides need to forgive each other. Kind of feel like this may be a one-way street here. Secondly, will you actually admit what you did wrong? Because that's really the crux here of the argument, right? If you're simply like, let's declare an amnesty and no one has to own up or confess to their sins, then no, that doesn't work, right? Like maybe it's just me being raised Roman Catholic, but I remember when you go to confession, you actually have to confess for the shit in order to be forgiven. And I think that that's a big aspect here that isn't being given enough attention. I threw this out on my Instagram stories yesterday to get your guys' thoughts. Obviously, my audience, the Matt McKeever Unfiltered Instagram account is going to be biased to a certain extent. I was surprised, at least, that there was a handful of individuals that were open to the idea of amnesty. And again, that gives me hope that there's some form of reconciliation or way forward here versus like an outright civil war over the subject matter. I know that Tim Pool loves to reference the idea of civil war, and often in the context of abortion. But I personally think the discussions, as more information comes out about the pandemic and government responses, and maybe some shady dealings with pharmaceutical companies, that's more likely to be the spark. Because for the last 2 years, a lot of us remember being demonized. For the last 2 years, a lot of us remember being locked down, right? Forced out of our businesses, the constant struggles to just understand what are the rules going to be tomorrow. Or individuals like myself and Adam that dared to cross the border without a Arrive can and received $6,200 fines. There's a lot here to unpack, but let's explore this first around one of the quotes that is shared in the article. Some of these choices turned out better than others. To take an example close to my own work, there is an emerging, if not universal, consensus that schools in the US were closed for too long. The health risks of in school spread were relatively low, whereas the cost to students' well being and educational progress were high. The latest figures on learning loss are alarming. But in spring and summer 2020, we had only glimmers of information. Reasonable people who cared about children and teachers, advocated on both sides of the reopening debate. Now, I'm going to take offense there right off the bat because this does not feel like you're actually focused on the idea of admitting, like, mea culpa, right? Like, this is my fault. We're actually at fault here. So the argument constantly from the pro lockdowns, from the COVID zero crowd was better safe than sorry. But they never actually had the evidence on their side that children were at risk. They never had the evidence on their side that children were a particularly high vector of transmission, right? throughout this, we never actually saw the data lay out to justify schools being closed. Instead, we saw hysteria from teachers' unions. I think that they're one of the organizations that I hope have consequences to their constant bullying of politicians. Now, again, politicians should be able to stand up to unions, but we know that for most progressive, that's not going to be the case, right? Because that's directly their base, and there's serious consequences there if they don't play to their base. Now, when we're actually thinking about the idea of amnesty when it comes to the pandemic response, I've seen the full spectrum, right? I've seen people say there's no need for amnesty because nothing that we did was wrong, right? And I fear that Justin Trudeau and a lot from his ilk will find themselves in that camp. And then I've seen people argue that we need like Nuremberg 2.0 trials, right? We need military tribunals. People need to literally maybe have capital punishment in regards to some of their responses and false narratives and misinformation they put forward. I don't know where I land. I'm pretty sure I don't land in the liberal category. I don't think that we should just move forward without at least recognizing and having people admit guilt here. I'm not sure, though, if we literally saw a Nuremberg 2.0 trial, that would heal society either. I think that if anything, it would cause a lot of individuals to double down and want to never admit fault, right? Very similar. I don't know if any of you guys ever actually watched the original Nuremberg trials or looked into some of the heads of Nazi Germany, but usually what you saw was either right out denial of the facts, right? Because they essentially couldn't admit it, or else they'd be held liable, or they committed suicide before ever actually being held responsible for it.
Or they were recruited in Operation Paperclip to work for the U.S. government.
Well, again, I think that most of these people already work for our government, so I'm not sure if that's going to be a play here. But I hear what you're saying, Adam. There certainly were a lot of individuals that essentially were granted amnesty during that period of time because of the fact that they were, useful, whether from an intelligence espionage or often a science background. And yeah, I'd like. What are your thoughts here, Adam? Do you think that you know of a satisfying solution?
Um, I well, so I think a useful place to start is I don't think that I also don't believe I land in the liberal camp saying no wrong was done, because I think empirically it can be very well demonstrated that we've basically lost a generation of children who are going to have very stunted education, and that will have compounding effects as they go through. Like, one way it was put recently on an interview I was listening to is like, we basically go from kindergarten to grade, I think it was like 2 or 3 they were talking about, and we learn to read. And then grades kind of 4 through university, we read to learn. And if you kind of skip those steps of learning to read, it just has these compounding negative effects for you as you go through life. And obviously, there would be massive cohorts of students that would have fit that bill for being in grades kindergarten through 3 or 4. And so they're going to be massively impacted. And the downstream effects of that are very, very hard to measure, I think, but obviously bad. I also don't think that seeing our politicians hanging would solve those problems either. And more than likely, I think you're correct, it would entrench people into their positions on either side of the camp. One thing that I do believe for myself was that this was a useful tool. So if I think about this purely selfishly, this was a useful tool to understand who in my life was going to be the ones that fold under pressure, and who in my life are the ones that were principled and would stand up for their beliefs. And I believe that was if nothing else, I can find value in that experiment. And so I view this sort of the way that if you ever had a friend, like if I take you back to high school and you had a friend and you gave them a secret to keep, and that secret was not kept, you likely would never keep a secret with them again. But that doesn't mean that they can't be your friend. And so I think I view the people who were calling me a crazy conspiracy theorist. I view my family members who literally looked at me in the face during like holidays and were like, you sit over there at like the fucking naughty table because you're not vaccinated, right? And then proceeded to tell me that they thought it was fucked that I was not vaccinated, despite me having like overwhelming evidence at that point that it didn't make a whole lot of sense to me to make that medical decision for myself based on the data that was available. For those people, I don't think, to go to the extreme, the Nuremberg thing makes a lot of sense, but I also don't think that I'll ever trust them again. So I don't know where that falls if we're actually saying, because I believe that the word amnesty, if we really thought about the definition, would mean like complete forgiveness, I guess. Like it would mean that they should have no consequences, but I do believe that they should have consequences. Like if they chose not to look at the same data that I was available to present to them, and they made that decision that they wanted to ignore that, like I think there should be consequences to that, even if it's just a lost in trust.
Yeah. Again, obviously, it's a very nuanced discussion here, and I don't think that we're going to solve it in today's episode. But to your point, Adam, about like those conversations with friends or family or whatever, for me, I view it as kind of a sorting mechanism to a certain extent, where I discovered or learned who are the critical thinkers, right? Who's capable of like putting in the work, leaning in, and doing research in order to try and get to the bottom of what's fact or fiction. I can remember like lots of different conversations, but one that stands out to me is a conversation with my dad where essentially at one point in time he asked me, who radicalized you? And obviously that kind of triggered me
Jesus,
because,
that's strong language.
and I responded, they did. Like they, the politicians, the mainstream media, the doctors that pretended like they'd actually read the studies and knew what was going on versus actually just being part of the propaganda wing. Um, I want to share the final thoughts here that were shared in this essay, and then I want to explore some of my thoughts towards how I think we move forward. The standard saying is that those who forget history are doomed to repeat it, but dwelling on mistakes of history can lead to a repetitive doom loop as well. Let's acknowledge that we made complicated choices in the face of deep uncertainty and then try to work together to build back and move forward. My answer here is a hard no. No, these were not complicated choices. You don't get to use that as a simple out. You don't get to be like, well, it was confusing at the time, so we made the best of the situation. No, the best of the situation would be standard operating procedure, right? Continue to move forward as is, or at least follow our pre existing pandemic response plans versus throwing it all out and just being like, well, we should copy paste China because why not? For me, at a minimum, if we were to explore amnesty, every politician that where there's written proof, video proof, audio proof that they constantly bullied, pushed, or pressured individual citizens to get the vaccine, you should be barred from any further public service. Any doctor, any educator, any union leader that did similar, again, you should be banned from any public service or any of your current industries as well. I think that that's how we move forward. I don't know if we need criminal trials. I don't know if that leads down a path of redemption in general for society, but I absolutely believe that there does need to be consequences to these individuals. I think that like politicians like Jagmeet Singh and Justin Trudeau do not deserve a pension on the other side of their political service. I think that they are traitors to the citizens that put them in power. And it doesn't matter if you were able to brainwash the majority of citizens into believing your lies, the lies still stand nonetheless. And so that's one of the things for me that's a line in the sand here is if they're not willing to admit fault. If they're not going to own up that mistakes were made, if instead they're going to choose to frame it as complicated choices, that's a no-go. That's a non-starter in my opinion. Maybe my views will evolve with time. Maybe as more information becomes available, I will soften. But right now, based upon the information that's available to me, that's where I stand. Anything you want to add here, Adam?
And I think that from my perspective, I do believe that if somebody wanted to have an honest conversation at this point and say, listen, I recognize this will probably cost me my political career, we fucked up. Like if somebody just straight up wanted to actually come up with that statement, I believe that I could at least move forward with the idea, right? Where like I think what you're saying rings very true, that like if they went the opposite of that, they said, no, we did everything we could with the information that we had, when like that was very clearly not true. Like anybody that was listening to Joe Rogan was getting better information than most of the country from like the CDC. So it's like, to me, that's an unacceptable position. And
Like,
and
just to
so
jump
if
in there, because you
yeah,
brought up Joe Rogan, but like we still have journalists journalists today in Canada within the last couple of weeks that have put out articles that say ivermectin is horse dewormer paste, right? Like, no, you
Exactly.
don't get to work for the CBC. Like, absolutely not. Not one penny of my tax dollars should go to support your financial livelihood. No, absolutely not, in my opinion. And I think that regardless, like, they need to understand there's consequences because, like, admitting fault isn't enough, in my opinion. I think there can be roads to redemption, but I see no reason why barring them from public service wouldn't be a great first step. And I understand that that would probably mean gutting significant portions of our government. And that to me is just simply a bonus. That's not the main goal of this, but that's a hell of a good bonus.
Yeah, I agree, Matt. Like, I think if you did make a fuck up of that size, you probably just shouldn't be holding that office. I think Mayday is participating here in the
Mayday agrees.
conversation. She agrees, right, buddy? She's been in the truck a couple hours now, so she's pissed right off. But I do think that there would be still a great question of like, well, then who does get to hold office, right? Like, who is actually better? Who could we trust with this stuff? And it's like, this becomes a really challenging question when we're working in a democracy where like clearly people voted for these guys, right? Like there were people out there that believed that this is the guy regionally, municipally, federally, that should be representing our interests. And it's like, okay, shit, then like if that's the guy we voted for, who's the guy that didn't make it, right? And it's like I think there are some good questions or good conversations to have there. Like if you gutted all these guys and got them out of the system, like who's their replacement, or is this just a hydra that springs up new heads too for everyone that you cut off, right? I don't. It's not obvious that would give us better results in the future. But I do agree it's a good place to start.
Like, again, to me, it simply comes down to there has to be consequences for the choices they've made. Because those of us that decide to go against the mainstream orthodoxy, we experienced those consequences for the last 2 years. But like I said, we're not going to solve it in today's video, but I want to have this conversation with you guys. I appreciate individuals jumping in and sharing their opinions in the comments as well. So again, appreciate you guys. Know you're not alone, and that's a big part of BDE Media here as well. But let's jump over to the second story of the day. This one to me is a doozy. I'm going to need to switch my browsers here because I'm not logged in on the other. But this is from Blacklock's Reporter. You guys, if you've never heard of Blacklock's Reporter, you should, and you enjoy anything that we produce here or anything that I've produced in the last year and a half around the pandemic, you guys should absolutely become a paid subscriber. I think they're one of the few media outlets that, like, absolutely without question deserve your money. Does Rebel News? Maybe. True North? Yeah, I think they probably do. Blacklock's Reporter? 100%. Because I believe that they're truly focused on trying to get to the bottom of facts. So this is from a Friday, October 29th article. Fear, a $500 million write-off. So already we're in a big dollar amount, right? Taxpayers face a $500 million write-off on overpayments to federal employees due to payroll bungles, auditors said yesterday. About half of these requests had been outstanding for more than 3 years, wrote Auditor General Karen Hogan. I covered this previously on the Maple Pill, but it's worth repeating all this. So if you guys don't remember the Phoenix pay system, this is a pay system that was... What?
Sorry, but before you even get started, is this still Phoenix screwing us over?
Yes.
Oh my God, really?
Yes, we continue to use it. And we've spent over $1 billion now, if I'm not mistaken, on producing Phoenix alone. But let's get into the details here. Since the launch of Phoenix, approximately 353,000 employees. How many employees do we got? Like, we're approaching, that's what, 1% of Canada's population. That's literally 1%, guy, of Canada's population. Employees have been identified as having received either an administrative overpayment or true overpayment, totaling $2.97 billion. Said overpayments, as of March 24th, overpayments were repaid to approximately 235,000 of these employees, representing a total of approximately $2.4 billion. But that still means that there's $500 million out there that we've overpaid. As of March 24th, a total of 118,000 employees have an outstanding overpayment balance, wrote staff. Workers who reported excess pay were offered generous terms on repayment schedules. We recognize the recovery of overpayments can be stressful, said the memo. The Auditor General yesterday said despite billions spent to correct the Phoenix pay system program, it continues to garble checks for a large number of employees, about 1 in 4. In our audit work, we found 28% of employees we sampled had an error. Is this not just absolutely insane, Adam?
That's flabbergasting. And like I guess I guess there's some real they do touch on it here, but like one of the things that was just said there is either an administrative overpayment or a true overpayment. So a true overpayment I would suggest is probably like literally just the wrong dollar amount was paid out. But these administrative overpayments could get complicated, right? Like this could be like incorrect deductions on employment insurance or like the actual source deductions required for employment. And I imagine that could have like actual interesting implications for the employees themselves. But yeah, like that's staggering, man. 1% of Canada's population being overpaid by the government. And then the interesting thing would be the hidden cost here, because they'll have to go and audit all this shit, right? So like they'll also have to go and reconcile that, which is going to take an entire team of people that need to actually reconcile the debts as well. So like, oh man,
Yeah.
this is
Well,
crazy.
and so it's estimated that the Phoenix issues here have cost taxpayers $2.6 billion. That doesn't count the billions of dollars to produce the software that doesn't work right.
Yes.
Like 1 in 4, like for
That's
the love of
fucking
God,
brutal, dude.
like it blows my mind that 1 in 4 errors. Like how did that ever pass QA? Right? Like
Well, I
how did
wonder,
that ever get rolled out?
like, what would the actual? I wonder what the rate would be of like people that get reassessed and like audited by the actual CRA to begin with. Like, I'm sure it's probably nowhere near 1 in 4. So is like the actual government itself worse than the average uninformed citizen of doing their own payments?
I think the answer is yes.
That's brutal, dude.
Right? Like, why do we trust these people with anything? But anyways, we've gone long on the first 2 stories, so I'm going to jump into the third one. Now, warning, this may actually get our YouTube channel canceled, Adam, so I hope you're feeling brave here. This could be our first hard strike. But
Whatever.
I think it's worth exploring this concept because I don't think there's definitive proof of this. And I see a lot of people who I respect pushing this narrative, and I think it's suspect right now. It may turn out to be true, but I don't think that the evidence is there yet. And again, you'll find links to this in our Telegram chat because I'm certain if we were to link this in our YouTube description or our title, that we likely would get a hard strike for misinformation. Embalmers are reporting unusual fibrous clots. So those of you that follow the same people as me on social media, you've probably seen these videos. I don't know why. I have a visceral reaction when I look at that shit and think about it being in my veins. Like it honestly, like
Yeah.
I can feel my stomach turning right now. But I want to share with you guys some of the data, and then I want to explore what I believe to actually be the nuance around this conversation. So Richard Hirschman, a licensed funeral director and embalmer in Alabama, said he's been seeing the clot since May 2021. He's been in the profession since 2001. He told the Counter Signal he absolutely thinks it's related to the COVID-19 vaccine and maybe the novel coronavirus. Since first discovering the clots over a year ago, he now reports seeing them in bodies he treats 50 to 70% of the time. Now, even that's a pretty big range, right? Like that feels like it's more based on anecdotal evidence than he's been tracking this as hard stats. The article goes on. There's a lot of like stomach churning. Like the thought that that's in my veins is just like, oh, it's a lot for me.
Yeah, you need an oil change if that's going run through.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the
But
Epic Times.
50 to 70% is a big number though, Matt. Like if you assumed that this guy was 10% accurate there, right? And 5 to 7% of his patients are people, well, I guess they're not patients if they're dead, but
Yeah,
like 5 to 7
customers.
of the people, the customers that were there had these things. I would think that that would be concerning enough. But anyways, I hear your point, right? This is obviously not
So yeah.
empirically studied, right?
So when I decided to start researching this a little bit further, one, I found this really weird document. I'm assuming this must have been submitted as evidence at like a city council Austin meeting because like for whatever reason, austintexas.gov, which is a government website, right, for the city of Austin, has a link here to an InfoWars article talking about this, right? And saying that essentially doctors warn the majority of vaccinated patients could have permanent heart damage. Some may die within 3 years. Obviously, very drastic claims here. This also involves a Canadian doctor who was demanding further study into the link between COVID-19 and vaccines and blood clots. But what I want to jump into is the AFP fact checkers have actually fact checked this, and they determined there was no evidence. And when I kind of go through their fact checks, it's hard for me to not disagree with them. I think that if I was to try and explain the situation based upon my research, I personally think that there's something going on here with blood clots, right? I think that we all know there's something going on with heart failure or cardiovascular events in individuals that you wouldn't normally suspect them to have those, right? However, as far as like getting into the details of what's causing this, I'm not sure that any individual could definitively point to the vaccines as the cause versus COVID 19. Obviously, COVID 19 somehow does something with your blood. It seems to impact your heart. And those are things that we didn't know, I think, day one when this pandemic started. However, I do just want to caution individuals to err on the side of due diligence, I guess, when it comes to wanting to jump to conclusions with this stuff. You know what? It may turn out 5 years from now, I look silly for even saying like we should be cautious about making these claims. Maybe it'll be definitively proven that the vaccines are the result of this. But I think that there's just as equal or maybe even a greater argument that COVID 19 may just be responsible for this. And this is one of the times that I'm going to side with the fact checkers and say there doesn't seem to be definitive proof on this. Now, that doesn't mean that it's completely unproven either. But understand, a study published in The Lancet in 2021 concluded that patients with a COVID 19 infection faced a significantly higher risk of developing blood clots than people who received mRNA vaccines. And now, a lot of individuals that think the vaccines are responsible for this will point to the fact that the European Medical Agency, right, they've pointed to rare cases of the vaccine causing blood clots. I think we've seen something similar from the Canadian government saying in very rare instances that has occurred. Again, is that a byproduct of the vaccines, or is that a byproduct of them getting the vaccines, then getting COVID afterwards, which again, we know, at least anecdotally, seems to have occurred in a handful of cases? Cause correlation, chicken and the egg here. I think it's honestly difficult to jump to conclusions, but to me, one of the reasons I want to be able to have a news show is to explore these things with you guys. I'm not telling you what the news is here, but I'm just saying that this is worth researching. This is definitely worth people looking into deeper. But I want to caution people when it comes to jumping to conclusions. I guess first things first, Adam, had you heard about this? And then if you had or hadn't, what's your general thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I had generally heard sort of the rumblings that blood clots were an issue with the vaccine, but I do agree with you, right? Like, I think the one thing that is true is that we don't know. Like, we actually don't know the long-term effects of either the vaccine or COVID-19, right? So I think that would be a very fair claim to make, is that it's hard to understand, and more importantly, it's probably really hard to do control tests, right? Because probably most people, everybody, I don't know, I think almost everybody by now would have been exposed to COVID-19. And so this is one of those things that we actually may never get a great answer on, right? Just from the sheer fact that like it might be very hard to get a control test done. These are the types of things, though, that you would have expected to see from something that was mandated. I think that's where we get into an interesting conversation, is like, if we don't know, how could we have mandated this and then enforced such heavy and punitive social pressures on people to make them go and do this drug? So I agree. I don't think that we can say definitively, and even this one, funeral home, right? Like, I don't think we can say honestly and intellectually that, like, yeah, this is the smoking gun we need to say that this was all bad, or that COVID-19 itself was going to be the thing that was all bad. Like, I agree with you. This is not definitive. So it could be dangerous to push either agenda. But one thing that is true, I think still, given that we don't know, is that it probably wasn't the right decision to enforce such social pressures on people who didn't know and then didn't want to get this thing, right? Like, it was genuinely a ton of social pressure to get this drug. So I think that's where I feel like I'm justified saying that was an inappropriate decision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, I'm just happy that we can share this with you guys. If we disappear off of YouTube, just a reminder, we will still be going live on Rumble. So if you guys don't watch us on Rumble, this is just kind of a call to action that if we ever disappear off YouTube, you can find us on Rumble. And let's jump into the last story of the day. This one from Spencer Fernando. I think you guys know I enjoy his blogs on a regular basis here. Survey: Canadians feel worse about finances now than in 2008 financial crisis. We previously covered yesterday, right, that food banks are at an all-time high of usage here in Canada. There's some stats that, I don't know, sometimes there's stats that come out that I'm just like there's a stat right now flowing around that appears to be true. Like they polled people on this, saying 1 in 4 Canadians skip a meal because of food costs. That's hard for me to believe. Like, I just feel like I would usually, like, if my life, I would think that if I ever got into a situation where money was tight, I might decrease the quality of food I eat, but I doubt I would decrease the quantity of food. So again, I think whenever we're talking about pollsters here, we need to really ask, like, how exactly was this question framed, and was there any underlying motive here? But again, month after month, inflation outstripping wage growth. That's definitely true. Meaning Canadians are falling further and further behind. Continued tax increases make things even worse. So, according to a Nanos research survey conducted for Bloomberg News, the number of Canadians who say their finances are worsening is larger now than during the global financial crisis. 47% of Canadians say their finances weakened during the past year, while just 13% say their finances have strengthened. That 47% figure is higher than during both the 2008 financial crisis, when the survey first started being conducted, and worse than during the massive economic contraction in the first half of 2020, when lockdowns became widespread. So, just again, I think this is an interesting discussion to have, because right now we see Jagmeet Singh in particular constantly pushing this greedflation narrative, right, and trying to demonize businesses. And it just, as we discussed in regards to food costs, I literally think that that's an outright lie, right? Like, when you look at the margins, just the facts do not back up his claims. And even if you were to mandate grocery stores not making $0, like making $0 in profit, we would still find like a 3-4% reduction in our prices in general when we're experiencing 10% plus annual inflation when it comes to food here in Canada. But desperately casting blame. With attempts to gaslight Canadians on the economic reality we see around us having failed, both the Liberals and NDP are now desperately trying to cast blame elsewhere. You already certainly know that Liberal NDP policies have contributed to higher inflation, with their hostility towards the energy sector driving down potential supply, their carbon tax driving up the price of everything, and their unrestrained spending enabled by the Bank of Canada, weakening the value of our money, right? And so right now you see things like Jagmeet Singh saying he wants to squash the GST or HST on heating costs, right, for Canadians this winter. But at the same time, he supported a 3 times increase in carbon taxes. Well, this is one of those things where it's like, I'm going to beat you with the stick, but it's going to be a slightly smaller stick than it otherwise would have been. And you're like, well, you're still beating me with a stick. So I'm not sure if I really want to thank you or turn to you as my savior. And that's kind of where I feel like with a lot of this greedflation narrative. One, being concerned about the cost of living for Canadians, absolutely. We should be concerned about that. I think that there's going to be consequences for years to come based upon the inflation we've experienced. It's a lot stickier than they originally told us. I see no reason to believe that it's becoming less sticky today than it was a few months ago when they were lying to us. So I guess, yeah, I'll just throw this out to you, Adam. What's your general thoughts? Do you think that Canadians are suffering financially? Do you think that some of the stat is being, misrepresented? We've talked about greedflation before.
Yeah, I obviously the greedflation thing's insane. When we showed the margins for the grocery stores being like 2% to 4%, I think was the max. And honestly, I think I'm rounding up with the 4%. So, I personally couldn't imagine ever running a business for less than a 10% margin. So I don't really get it. But I do think that it seems reasonable that Canadians would be experiencing financial trouble right now. Like inflation, like one of the things you said there is inflation outstripping wage growth, right? Which means every month your dollar's worth less, but you're not actually getting paid more monthly from your employer. And if your employer was to pay you more, that would just mean the cost of goods sold would go up, which would mean his price would have to rise, which is how we actually end up cycles of just like cost of living just becoming more for everybody, right? Because then your consumer has to pay more, so they need to get paid more. It's this whole thing. But I also don't know who gets polled anyways. Like, where are they polling these damn people? What's the sample size? What are they asking them?
I can admit with pride, I've never been polled.
I've certainly never been polled. But I mean, I think it's unfortunate, man. And again, it's the product of these things like the Phoenix system, right? That's that story we just shared. Like, who do you think pays for it when we have billions of dollars invested into a software that doesn't work and requires teams of auditors to figure its shit out? And this is just like literally one tiny example from a story that we're sharing today. Like, of course, it's going to be us, right? It's the Canadians. They're going to print more money, which leads to that inflation that everybody's suffering from, which pumps up the price of everything that people need to sell. So it's a vicious circle, and I would certainly believe that there would be Canadians in financial distress right now, and I don't think it's going to be helped that much by the fact that the real estate market's getting punished right now too, because I do believe that Canadians disproportionately leverage their, you could call them assets, but really they're liabilities. Like, people, generally speaking, in these times would turn to their line of credit or refinancing their home or even potentially having to sell their home. And now is not going to be a great time to be doing that. There's going to be massive losses in equity if you purchased recently, and the capital that you are borrowing is going to be more expensive. So I think that these vicious circles they're truly vicious because they're so self-fulfilling in nature. So yeah, I mean, I also don't know if that offers anybody any help at all. I empathize with the Canadians that had their head down for the last couple of years, thought everything was going to be great, possibly even got into bad financial situations because money was so cheap and money was so accessible and there was so much liquidity in the markets and housing was just flying up in terms of value. And there's people that would have refinanced even at the height of that market, and now their mortgage is, hundreds of dollars more per month, and their rates are going to go up when they go to renew, right? Or those people that bought new vehicles because money was so cheap and they waited years for that truck, right? And then finally we get the processors or the whatever those semiconductor chips were, and now we get the truck, but now it's $1,300 a month. And like, damn, dude. I had the other day, my, again, anecdotal as hell, but my insurance company called me to ask if I wanted to essentially have them refinance all my vehicles for me. I was like, what, is this a thing? And they're like, yeah, we've been helping out so many people in our policies by helping them refinance their vehicles. And I'm like, well, okay, at what rate? And these guys are refinancing everybody's vehicles out at 7%. Right? 7% on in $60,000 and $80,000, $100,000 vehicle. That's a lot of money that the average Canadian would be spending to just keep their vehicle in the driveway, right? And keep them employable in a way where they can drive to work every day. So I think that these problems, they're going to ripple everywhere. And I honestly don't know the solution other than like a full-on crazy recession or Bitcoin. But it's going to take a lot I think, to reset this system.
Yeah, I think there's going to be financial consequences for years to come, and it's important that people focus on getting their financial house in order today, in my opinion. And yeah, so anyways, that's it for today's news update, guys. We're not going to have a second half to today's show. Obviously, Adam's traveling. I don't think Mayday would put up with a second half to the show anyways. We will be back tomorrow, and we'll be back on our regular schedule. So we will have a second half of tomorrow's show. And in the second half of tomorrow's show, I'm going to be teasing with you guys the first couple minutes of this special project I've been working on. Honestly, I'm so proud of what I'm doing here. I really hope it resonates with people the way that I intend it to. I've literally been spending like 10, 12 hours minimum a day on my laptop editing up this video. I've got over 200 different sources already right now in this video essay. So I am fired up to get deep into everything around the Freedom Trucker Convoy protest. So in the second half of tomorrow's show, I'm going to be sharing with you guys what I believe to be, depending on how you want to define it, 10 or 11 of the most frustrating false narratives presented to us by mainstream politicians and mainstream legacy press media. So that's what you guys can look forward in tomorrow's episode. Otherwise, we'll let Adam get back on the road because I don't think Mayday is going to put up with us much longer. But I appreciate those of you jumping in the comment section. Really appreciate the comments from Kohana, as well as Chicken Little. I see those of you watching us on Rumble as well. You guys seem to never jump in the chat, but I do appreciate it because I assume you're not all bots. But if you guys enjoyed this video, smash the like, hit the Rumble button, hit subscribe. Make sure you check out the Telegram group. Again, everything's free here with BDE Media right now. So we just want to build an audience. We just want to have two-way conversations with you guys. We appreciate you guys supporting us. So again, thanks guys, and we'll see you tomorrow. And I'll pull up our outro right here. See you guys.
Later.
They say life is what you make it. So what happens if you actually try? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day?